if we're talking about abuse more broadly, when does it become abuse? Partners can argue, can disagree, can say things that are hurtful that we wouldn't, right? That's just part of having a partner. And then, but at some point it passes a certain threshold where you're saying that is abuse. How do you think about that?
That's a great question. I haven't seen much discussion on that for a long time. And I actually, when I talk to my students, I teach the class on family violence. This is what I ask them to do, is just to think where this normal family communication, what can be quite dysfunctional, but not violent, not abusive, ends, and when this kind of abusive behavior that we're talking about starts. Great question. I think we have to look at several things. First is, of course, the legislation in the country we live in. And in Canada, certain forms of behavior are just outlawed as violent or abuse. So we don't have in Canada special legislation against intimate partner violence. So it's a part of the criminal code of Canada. The same as in Russia. I came originally from Russia, so it's the same as there, right? While some countries have specific provisions for the intimate partner violence or family violence. So in Canada, just the if it's abuse, it means it's a physical harm. It's all kind of beatings, physical abuse. It's all part of the criminal code. So all these behaviors, and technically pushing somebody, hurting somebody physically, this is actually abuse, right? So this is a physical abuse. Logically, it is harder to provide evidence for these forms of behavior within the family. So right now, Canada is working on decriminalizing coercive control. So they're actually trying to criminalize forms of behavior that are extremely difficult to prove, which would be controlling behavior, asking questions about the way you've been, what you've done, and doing it consistently. So some countries did it already, like England, Scotland. So we kind of following their path, and it's a very interesting how it will be implemented, and if we do not hurt victims in the middle of this, because unfortunately what happens that we want to do some good, but we, as it happens with, I'm a little bit digressing right now, as it happens with mandatory abuse laws in the United States. So mandatory laws means that in every case of abuse, whenever it comes known to the police, the arrest should be made. Somebody should be arrested. So it was implemented as a great progress in, drawing attention to domestic violence as unacceptable behavior and so on. But then we've learned that many victims were started to be afraid for the police to come because they didn't want their partners to go to prison because they depended on them financially, right? They don't want them. They want violence to stop, but not necessarily the intervention of the criminal justice system. So I'm worried that something may happen the same with the criminalization of coercive control. But in a way, towards your question, the forms of behavior, first, as I've mentioned, is a legal system, right? So the definition of physical violence is clear if a person is hurt. And of course, if it's an accident, it's an accident. But if it's an intentional behavior to hurt another partner, use a weapon on them, right? Burn them somehow.
Does it have to actually hurt them, right? So you could imagine something where a person throws something at another person, right? So in certain cases it could be an intent to hurt, but it won't actually happen.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it shouldn't hurt. The consequences are just it's much easier to prove that it happens. But no, it shouldn't hurt. There should be an intention. But since these cases are extremely difficult because it's a he and she said, and there are very often no witnesses present, so it's extremely difficult to actually investigate what happened. That is why we had some ideas in place for the criminal justice systems. They were trained to believe a woman. So that is why woman would be considered as a primary victim and man would be considered as a primary perpetrator. That is why this is how the system kind of simplified the way how you deal with intimate partner violence situations. That is why it's so damaging for male victims who are actually victims in the situation. But the entire training system and entire criminal justice approach is based on seeing them as perpetrators. So other examples, of course, it's not just legislation, it's also how victims feel. This is how they feel, and if victims, especially when it comes to the psychological aggression or coercive control, if they feel that they terrorized in their family, they're afraid for their life, they can no longer communicate with the loved ones, they're isolated by the perpetrator. Again, it's extremely difficult to recognize these forms, and victims themselves very much justify this behavior by the perpetrator. Oh, he wants me the best, or she wants me the best, or she or he is right. It's extremely difficult, everything when it comes to this. But when it's a clear perpetrator who is dominating a victim, then in this case, the victim may go and look for help. Again, without the coercive control legislation, it's harder to do, to make a case of that. So yes, I think with all these different situations in the family life, anything that people, especially when they educated and informed that this is called abuse, this is what abuse is. The reality in many families, many people don't see the clearly abusive situations as abusive. They just don't call them that. This is what we saw with male victims. They just don't never call it that way. They never say it. Statistics Canada conducts every 5 years general social survey and victimization. They ask the question, why didn't you look for help? And this is the answer to your question. They say, I've never seen it as a major problem. I've never seen it as a criminal justice system problem. I would never call it abuse. It's something that we can fix, and so on and so forth. So a lot of rationalization, a lot of explanation, just because I know this person, we've been through this, and she's going through a difficult time. So there are so many different ways how people explain themselves the situation without calling it abuse.